All right, everyone. So I want to talk to you guys about NATO. NATO always presents itself as the party of peace. It always presents itself as the powerhouse that is trying to advance peace, democracy, and international law. But is this really true? The fact of the matter is, NATO hates peace. NATO is not interested in peace. NATO is interested in perpetuating war. NATO is interested in making war inevitable and provoking countries into going to war. Because NATO has a military-industrial complex, but also NATO has an interest in maintaining its empire. Because at the end of the day, NATO is America's empire. And in order to maintain the empire, NATO has to go to war. NATO needs an enemy to demonstrate to other countries not to mess with the authority of NATO. So, let's get a little bit into this topic because there is a very good example of what I'm talking about. And that is the Kosovo War back in the late 1990s. So back in the late 1990s, you had the Serbs and you had the Kosovar Albanians. And the Kosovar Albanians were a part of Serbia, and in turn, they were a part of Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia was this political bloc of power that consisted of various Balkan countries, and the center of Yugoslavia was Serbia, and the most pro-Yugoslav people in Yugoslavia were the Serbs, and the Serbs wanted to maintain the unity of Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia consisted of different ethnic groups that historically have had quite a bit of violence between each other. You had Croatia, the Croats, they didn't like the Serbs and vice versa, and there is still a lot of enmity between those two people. I mean, especially given the fact that the Croatians collaborated with the Nazis and butchered hundreds of thousands of Serbs during the reign of terror of the Nazis. And you also had the Bosnians. They didn't like the Serbs, and the Albanians in Kosovo definitely did not like the Serbs. But Serbia wanted to maintain the integrity of Yugoslavia. Serbia wanted to keep Yugoslavia intact. But the Americans did not want this. The Germans did not want this. NATO did not want Yugoslavia to exist. Why is this? Because Yugoslavia was really the last final block of power that was not under the American Empire. That was the reason why. It had nothing to do with atrocities being done by Serbs against Bosnians and against Albanians. No, it had everything to do with empire. And so the Americans and the other Westerners, they needed to find a reason, or they needed to find a pretext by which to justify a war of aggression against the Serbs. So, in the late 1990s, they pointed to the Kosovo conflict between the Serbs and the Albanians. Now, if any of you are from the Balkans, you may be thinking, well, why aren't you mentioning the conflict between Serbia and Bosnia, or the conflict between Serbia and Croatia? Well, that was in the early part, or really in the middle of the decade of the 1990s. We're talking about the tail end of the 1990s. And we're talking about the conflict that really gave the final death blow to Yugoslavia. There were conflicts in the mid-1990s between the Serbs and the Bosnians, and between the Croatians and the Serbs. And there was even a phase of the conflict in which the Croatians and the Bosnians were fighting each other. But eventually, the Bosnians and the Croatians joined forces to fight against the Serbs. Sorry, I'm a little bit wet here. I got out of the shower. So, at the tail end of the decade of the 1990s, you had the Albanians versus the Serbs. And NATO said, okay, we're going to back the Kosovar Albanians. Now, Kosovo was and still is a very, very special place to the Serbian people because the Serbs hold up the region of Kosovo as the place where Orthodox Serbian Christianity began. So it's similar to how the Russian Orthodox Christians see Ukraine, because Christianity in Russia began in Ukraine with Saint King Vladimir, who was the king of the Rus, and from Ukraine, Christianity spread to the rest of Russia. So just as Ukraine is very special to the Russian Orthodox, and also, I almost forgot to mention, in Ukraine, you have a church called I think it's called the Pachak Lavra, and this is considered to be one of the most, if not the most special church in all of Russian Orthodoxy. But anyway, the Serbs definitely hold Kosovo as a very important place geopolitically, historically, culturally, and religiously. But the Albanians, they wanted Kosovo for themselves, and they wanted to purge out the Serbs from Kosovo. They did not want the Serbs to be in Kosovo. And so there was a terrorist organization known as the KLA, or the Kosovo Liberation Army. And the KLA, they were a bunch of Islamo-Nazis. And the reason why I use that term, I don't use that term just as a pejorative. It really is a fitting term for the KLA because they were indeed Nazis who were Muslim. And a lot of these KLA fighters were people whose grandparents were Nazis who collaborated with the Third Reich. There was, in fact, an Albanian division in the Nazi SS. So these younger Albanians, this later generation of Albanians, were very proud of the fact that their grandparents were Nazis. And so they considered themselves to be Nazis. They were also drug dealers. And to a certain extent, they were also Islamists. So they had a lot of hatred against the Serbs. There is a history of this going all the way back to before even World War II. You can go back to the Austro-Hungarian Empire and read about how the Austrians backed the Albanians against the Serbs. And the whole purpose of going against the Serbs in regards to the Austro-Hungarian Empire was to weaken a Russian ally in the Balkans. So there is a history of the West backing the Albanians against the Serbs because of the Serbs' enthusiasm for Russia, because the Serbs have historically been an ally of the Russians for quite a long time. And there is a reason for this. I hate to go off into different streams of thought here, but it does connect to the overall theme of this video. But one of the main reasons as to why the Serbs are so pro-Russia is because Russia helped to create the actual nation of Serbia. Not a lot of people talk about this, but there was a war between the Serbs and their Russian allies and the Ottoman Empire back in the 1870s. And from, I want to say 1877 into 1878, the Russians and the Serbs fought against the Ottomans for Serbia's independence. And then at the end of the war, the Russians were the victors, and so they said, hey, Russia's the winner, we call the shots. Turkey, Ottoman Empire, you better carve out Serbia and create an independent Serbian state. And the Ottomans had no choice but to comply. They had to cede territory. The Ottoman Empire got smaller. The Ottoman Empire lost a lot of its European territory, and Serbia became an independent country. So Serbia is an independent country because of Russia, because of the Russian Empire. So fast forward to the 1990s, the Soviet Union has just fallen. Russia is very, very weak, and Russia is in absolutely no position to be fighting in any wars, especially against NATO. So NATO smells blood. Now, NATO, as I've said, NATO for the longest time, since its very origin, has presented itself as the political power that just wants peace, democracy, and international law. But in the 1990s, NATO was like a bunch of vultures seeing a dying animal, and they're waiting for the animal to die, and when the animal is dead, they smell blood. Well, the Soviet Union had just died. And so countries like America, Germany, were very happy about this. And so they said, okay, the Russian Empire is dead. The Soviet Russian Empire is dead. Now that's weakened Russia's Serbian ally, because the Serbs, as I've said, historically have always been very pro-Russia. So they said, now's the time to finish off Yugoslavia. So they began to back the KLA, the Albanian Nazi Islamist. And the KLA began to do attacks and ambushes on Serbian police officers in Kosovo. And they began to kill a lot of Serbian people. And the whole purpose of killing the Serbs was to spark and provoke a violent reaction from the Serbs. And they got exactly what they wanted. The Serbs fought back. Did the Serbs do abuses? I'm sure they did. But nonetheless, it was a provocation. And it was a provocation to get the Serbs to fight against the KLA. Now, the Serbs, they fought against a terrorist organization, which is very legitimate. And the thing is that when you look at NATO propaganda, the Serbs are always portrayed as the bad guys. You know, especially if you watch, and this is a perfect example of NATO propaganda, there was a film that was called Behind Enemy Lines, starring Owen Wilson. And this is, it's a very well-done movie. It's a very well-done action movie, but it's propaganda. It portrays the Serbs as the bad guys, and NATO is the good guys. When the reality is that NATO was backing a bunch of terrorists who were bent on ethnically cleansing the Serbs out of Kosovo, and NATO was going to help facilitate that. The faction, or the belligerent that did the majority of the violations was not the Serbs. It was the KLA. And this is not me saying this. This is William Walker saying this. William Walker was an American diplomat whose job it was to investigate what was happening in Kosovo in the 1990s. The reality is that William Walker was commissioned to find dirt on the Serbs to justify a war against the Serbs in Kosovo. But William Walker said in private, he said, yeah, the majority of the violations that were broken by the KLA. The KLA did the majority of the violations. And the Germans virtually created the KLA. The Germans armed, they backed the KLA, they provided German uniforms to the KLA. Just watch a video of KLA fighters, you'll see they were wearing German uniforms. And the KLA were doing terrorist attacks. And so the Serbs said, okay, we have to fight back. This was the entire scheme. It was to get the Serbs to fight against the KLA. And then the NATO propaganda machine would come along and say, you see, look, the Serbs are attacking the Albanians in Kosovo, the Serbs are the aggressors, when the reality was that it was the KLA who were the aggressors. The Americans come along and the Germans come along and they say, okay, let's make a ceasefire. And the Serbs said, okay, fine, we agree to the ceasefire. The problem was that the KLA never signed on to the ceasefire. They never went to the KLA to sign onto a ceasefire. They only went to the Serbs to sign onto a ceasefire. And General Wesley Clark had a private meeting with a German general by the name of Klaus Naumann. It was said in this meeting between Wesley Clark and Klaus Naumann that the KLA needs to be pressured to stop attacking the Serbs, or else the Serbs are going to attack the KLA. They never really stopped the KLA from doing attacks, and the KLA continued to do attacks. And they did this for the sole reason of getting a provocation in order to get NATO to do a military intervention against the Serbs. And there was the leader of the KLA, his name was Hashim Thaçi, and Hashim Thaçi said, any armed action we undertake would bring retaliation against civilians. We knew we were endangering a great number of civilian lives. This was the strategy all along. And so there was this incident in which the KLA murdered a bunch of young Serbian men who were out drinking one night. They just murdered them. And this happened in a city called Peć. And Peć is a city in Kosovo, and Peć is a very important city for the Serbs because it is considered to be the birthplace for Orthodox Serbian Christianity. And so this was one of the this was just one example of what the KLA was doing. And then there was this place called Racak. And in this town, the KLA ambushed a bunch of Serbian police officers. The Serbian police officers fought back, and they had no choice but to call in the Serbian army. Serbian soldiers entered the fray, and there was an hours-long battle that ensued. And the Serbian army killed a bunch of these KLA guys, and then they left. And so because they left, the KLA then, as a result, just retook the town of Racak. And then the next day, they brought in Mr. William Walker, this American official. And they said, look, Mr. Walker, look at all these bodies here, because the Serbs came in and massacred our people. And William Walker said, oh my gosh, look, a terrible massacre done by the Serbs. And the Western media apparatus came along and they reported the story as this atrocity done by the Serbs. And Madeleine Albright, the Secretary of State at the time, she was very, very happy because she said, look, we have our reason to bomb the Serbs. And she hated the Serbs, even though she was a Holocaust survivor who was actually given refuge by a Serbian family. Her life was saved by a Serbian family. And look at what she did when she got older. She wanted to go to war against the Serbs. And so she said, look, there was this massacre in this place called Racak. We have our reason to bomb the Serbs. But then later on, there was a Finnish forensic investigation that was done on what happened in Racak. And this Finnish investigation said, well, listen, we saw the bodies and we noticed that there is gunpowder residue on the hands. And the reason why there's gunpowder residue on these people's hands, on the hands of these corpses, is because these people were in a battle. And we look at the bullet holes on the bodies, and we notice, just from the bullet holes, that these people were shot from a long distance. Meaning, these people were not killed in a massacre. These people were killed as they were fighting in a battle. And as I said, there was an hours-long battle in Racak between Serbian forces and the KLA. And so the Finnish forensic investigation concluded that there was no massacre in Racak. There was a battle. And the KLA presented the bodies as victims of Serbian bloodthirstiness. But the conclusion and the evidence that was found by the Finnish forensic investigation did not matter at this point because NATO had its pretext. Now, as the old saying goes, a lie will travel all throughout the earth before the truth can put its socks on. And this was certainly an example of this. So Madeleine Albright, she got her pretext. She wanted to bomb the Serbs. She was really a bloodthirsty cunt. I mean, really, she was a bloodthirsty, evil bitch, this Madeleine Albright was. And she really wanted war. And again, this was part of the military-industrial complex. War is a massive business. And it's interesting to note that after the Cold War, the people over at the Pentagon were saying, what the hell are we going to do now? I mean, the Pentagon was spending a lot of money on the Cold War. And when the Cold War was over, they were saying, listen, what are we going to do? We got this ginormous defense budget. What are we going to spend it on? Well, might as well just start a war in Yugoslavia. Two birds were hit with one stone. NATO made money from a war in from a war in the Balkans. And the last political block of power that was not under the American empire was going to be destroyed. And America was going to advance its empire in the Balkans. And so America didn't go to war just yet after the incident in Racak. They decided, well, we're going to present ourselves as people who are lovers of peace. We're going to present ourselves as peacemakers. And we're going to give the Serbs a chance. Give the Serbs a chance to sign on to a peace agreement. So NATO presented this peace deal It's known as the Rambouillet peace deal, and it was anything but a peace deal. It was really just a poison pill to present the Serbs as unreasonable, bloodthirsty people who were not interested in peace. But anyway, NATO presented the Rambouillet peace deal, peace proposal to the Serbs, and part of the Rambouillet peace proposal was that Serbia would recognize Kosovar autonomy, that Serbia would allow Kosovo to have autonomy. And the Serbs said, yeah, that's fine. We agree. They can have autonomy. And the Americans were very frightened by this. They said, oh my God. Madeleine Albright was frightened by this. They said, oh my goodness. The Serbs actually look reasonable. The Serbs are actually presenting themselves as reasonable. They're actually saying, okay, we can concede to this. We can say, okay, we can give Kosovo autonomy. So the Americans, the Westerners, they didn't like this. They didn't like this one bit. The Germans didn't like this. The Americans didn't like this. They didn't like this at all. So NATO added an extra stipulation. They added an extra term to the deal. And this term was something that they knew damn well the Serbs would never accept. And that was that Serbia had to agree to give up all of its sovereignty to NATO. That Serbia would have to agree to allow NATO to deploy its forces throughout any part of Serbia, throughout any part of Yugoslavia, at any time that it so wished. So you would have, according to this deal, you would have just a bunch of NATO soldiers everywhere, no matter what, and these NATO soldiers could go anywhere they wanted, and they could drive around in their jeeps, and they could deploy their military vehicles in any part of Serbia, according to this deal. And Serbia said, no, we can't accept this. We cannot accept this because you are asking us to just give up our sovereignty. And that's something that we are not willing to do. Aha! Madeleine Albright got exactly what she wanted. And that was to make the Serbs look like the obstinate, bloodthirsty barbarians who did not want peace. And NATO now had the opportunity to say, look, we gave them a peace deal, and they have completely rejected it. Madeleine Albright, this evil, bloodthirsty bitch, demanded that, quote, NATO personnel shall enjoy, together with their vehicles, vessels, aircraft, and equipment, free and unrestricted passage and unimpeded access throughout the FRY, the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, including associated airspace and territorial waters. The New York Times admitted, quote, under an annex of the Rambouillet Accord, a purely NATO force was to be given full permission to go anywhere it wanted in Yugoslavia, immune from any legal process. British Foreign Office Minister Lord Gilbert later admitted to a House of Commons Defense Committee that the part of the proposal that required the military occupation of Serbia was designed to be rejected. And here is what Henry Kissinger said. The Rambouillet text, which called on Serbia to admit NATO troops throughout Yugoslavia, was a provocation, an excuse to start the bombing. And initially, the KLA refused to sign on to the agreement because the agreement did not provide a referendum for full independence for Kosovo. But the Americans went to the KLA and they said, listen, you don't understand. The whole purpose of this deal is to get the Serbs to reject it. So sign on to the damn agreement so you guys could look like the reasonable faction, even though we know very well that you guys are a bunch of drug-dealing Nazis. Just sign the damn thing to appear that you guys are the peaceful ones. We know the Serbs are going to refuse to sign on to it. That way, we can present the Serbs as the warmongering, bloodthirsty barbarians. And so the KLA signed on to it. And Madeleine Albright later said if the Serbs would not agree and the Albanians would agree, then there was a very clear cause for using force. And this is exactly what she wanted. And then you had the Assistant Secretary of State, Jamie Rubin, and this guy admitted that the goal of the peace process was to create clarity where before there was ambiguity. Quote, and that meant the Kosovo Albanians agreeing to the package and the Serbs not agreeing to the package. And Jamie Rubin also said, quote, obviously, publicly, we had to make clear we were seeking an agreement. But privately, we knew the chances of the Serbs agreeing were quite small. So he is admitting that we were publicly trying to present ourselves as the peacemakers or as people who wanted peace. But the reality is we knew all along that the Serbs were not going to sign on to it. And that was the entire goal. So they gave the Serbs an offer that they knew they were going to refuse. And when the Serbs refused, NATO, the Americans, the Germans, the British, they said, aha, Madeleine Albright, Jamie Rubin, they said, aha, we have our pretext to bomb Serbia and destroy Yugoslavia. And they did. And they did. Now, there were a bunch of people in those days who were pro-NATO, and they said, NATO is for peace and democracy. We have to side with NATO. And the reason why they fell for that nonsense is because they were believing the propaganda. While behind closed doors, behind the curtains, there was a conspiracy being brewed up. And the conspiracy was, let's get the Serbs to refuse an offer we know they cannot accept so that we can make up a pretext to bomb them and destroy Yugoslavia. Not because we really care about the Albanians, but because we want to destroy a competitor to the American empire. Yugoslavia's whole philosophy was, we're not going to be under the Russians, we're not going to be under the Americans nor NATO, we're going to be an independent bloc of power. And the Americans said, no, you're not. And they basically told the Serbs, you got two choices. Either you agree to give up your sovereignty to NATO and allow NATO to expand in the Balkans and destroy Yugoslavia and destroy your guys' autonomy, or we're going to force you to accept NATO expansion in your country. So you have all these people who say, oh, all these countries that are a part of NATO, they chose to be a part of NATO. That may be true for the most part, but that was definitely not the case for Serbia. Serbia was forced to be under NATO's superintendence. And Serbia historically has been Russia's greatest ally in Europe. And so the Russians are watching what's happening and they're thinking, damn, they just bombed our ally. They just expanded into Serbia by force. So how in the hell can we expect the Russians to just accept NATO expansionism onto its borders or next to its borders and think that it's a great thing? How can we expect the Russians to do that when back in the 1990s, the Russians watched as the NATO military machine forced Serbia to accept NATO expansionism? And we say, oh, look, the Russians see NATO expansionism as aggression. It's not aggression. It's just a mere security umbrella that these European countries have accepted to be under. It's not aggression. What the hell happened to Serbia when Serbia refused to be under NATO's empire? Serbia got bombed. And that was Russia's biggest ally in Europe, and it still is. And the Russians watched and they said, damn, NATO is an aggressor. NATO is a warmongering machine that is fueled by a massive military-industrial complex. And if we allow NATO to just expand to wherever it wants and expand to the point where it's at our borders, we're going to be further isolated. And then we sit there and act dumb when Russia invaded Ukraine. Like, why did Russia invade Ukraine? Oh my God. Because NATO didn't know when to stop. NATO did not respect Russia's boundaries. And we will sit there and pretend to be the party of peace when we're anything but that. I am a citizen of the biggest empire in the world, of the only empire in the world. And as a subject and as a citizen of the American empire, I know damn well that America is an aggressor country. I live in an aggressor country. And it's amazing. You know, we'll sit there and talk about, oh, well, we have to support Israel because Israel has a right to defend itself. And then you see all of the atrocities done by Israel, and you see what happened recently. Israel bombed the Nasser hospital, one of the last actual functioning hospitals in Gaza. It bombs the Nasser hospital, kills tens of people. And then when the emergency responders arrive to the hospital to save people and to help people, what happens? Israel kills the emergency responders. Now you can sit there and say, oh, well, that's just Hollywood. Bullshit. There's actual video of it. There is actual video that you can see of these emergency responders being slaughtered by the Israeli military, and you see the aftermath, a bunch of dead bodies strewn on a freaking staircase. It's something out of a horror movie, except it's not a movie, it's reality. This is happening under America's watch. It's being backed by American tax dollars. It's being backed by America's military-industrial complex. And what did Donald Trump say? He said, finish the job. He said, finish the job, and you'll have Steve Witkoff and Donald Trump and what's his name, Huckabee, and the rest of these bastards, Ted Cruz, sit there and present themselves as the desirers of peace, as people who want peace, as the peacemakers. But what did Donald Trump tell Israel? He said, finish the job. And there was a peace process that was being done, and this peace process, brokered by the United States, had 3 phases. And part of the first phase was that Israel would release Palestinian prisoners and Hamas would release Israeli hostages. And it happened. And then Hamas said, okay, let's enter phase 2. And Israel said, no, we don't want to enter phase 2. Why? Because Netanyahu's hardline fanatics, who are a part of his political coalition, Smotrich, Ben-Gvir, and the gang, the Third Temple gang, they said, we don't want to enter phase 2. And they told Netanyahu, if you actually make peace in Gaza, we're going to leave your coalition and your whole political apparatus is going to fall apart. It's going to fall to tatters, and you're going to be done. And guess what? If your political coalition is done, there's going to have to be a re-election in Israel, and you may not win. And that would mean you actually having to face your criminal corruption trial. And so Netanyahu said, I'm not going to even follow the peace process. He said that. He told his people. He said, we're not going to follow the peace process. We don't give a shit about the peace process. And what happened? Israel, early this year, bombed Gaza and killed hundreds of people and broke the ceasefire. Because the end goal is not peace. You have these Zionists who sit there and say, we just want peace. We just want peace. They don't want peace. Israel does not want peace. Israel wants expansionism. They want to take all of Gaza and make it part of Israel and fulfill the agenda that was held by the Zionists going all the way back to the 1910s. Take Gaza, take the West Bank. And you see the horrors being done by Israel. You have, I was watching a video of this British medical professional who was helping people in Gaza, and he said, one thing that I noticed with my patients in Gaza is how you would see clusters of bullets in certain parts of the body, and how there would be a pattern in where the bullets were, in which part of the body you would find the bullets. He said, so you would have one day where you would have a bunch of people coming in, and they all had bullets in the same parts of their body. They all had bullets in their chest. And then one day, you would have people who were shot in the testicles. And so this British medical professional, he said, I notice a pattern here. You have one day where a bunch of people are coming in with blown off testicles, and then you have one day where people are coming in with bullets in their chests. What the hell is going on here?
But my colleagues in the emergency room describe a very clear pattern where on particular days they'll see different body parts targeted. So on one day they'll all be abdominal gunshot wounds, on another day they'll all be head gunshot wounds or neck gunshot wounds, on another day there'll be arm or leg gunshot wounds. And on last Saturday there were 4 young teenage boys all brought in very, very rapidly in succession with gunshot wounds to their testicles. So they're clearly being targeted to their testicles. And this is a pattern that we're seeing every day, that these young teenage boys are systematically being targeted. And it's almost as if a game is being played, that they're deciding to shoot the head today and the neck tomorrow and the testicles the day after.
There's sadism here. There is pure evil. This is not a war of defense. It's not a war of self-defense. It's not a war against terrorism. This is a war of ethnic cleansing, extermination, but it's also a war of sadism. It's a war consisting of a policy of sadistic pleasure. The sadistic pleasure in watching people suffer and watching people getting killed. But Huckabee and all these schmucks will sit there and cover up for it. And NATO will say, we're all for peace. If you're really for peace, put an end to what's happening in Gaza. Put an end to this horror movie that's happening in Gaza. NATO is not for peace. And you see the same thing going, not the same thing, but you see a similar trend or a similar modus operandi happening with Russia, where America is saying, okay, we want peace between Ukraine and Russia's like, okay, we want peace too, but there's certain things that we want. There's certain terms that we have here. And if those terms are not going to be fulfilled, you ain't going to get no deal. Now, perhaps Donald Trump really wants peace between Russia and Ukraine. Perhaps he does, right? I'm going to give, you know what? To hell with Huckabee. Huckabee's evil. Hegseth is evil. Ted Cruz is definitely evil. These guys are evil because they see the crimes, they cover up for it. At least Donald Trump says, listen, there is starvation in Gaza. At least Donald Trump told the Israelis, allow food to come in because I don't like to see starving kids. So I'm going to give Donald Trump the benefit of the doubt here. I'm going to give him the benefit of the doubt here. I could be wrong, but I'm going to give it to him. And perhaps Donald Trump really does want peace between Gaza and Israel, between Ukraine and Russia. Perhaps he does, right? I'm probably wrong, but let's just say that. If that is the case, the people in the Pentagon, the people who are in the upper echelons of power when it comes to the military-industrial complex, definitely don't want peace. And what are they telling the Russians? They're saying, oh, well, we can have European troops in the parts of Ukraine not controlled by Russia. And Russia said, no, we're not going to allow that, because the entire purpose of this war was to make Ukraine into a buffer zone between Russia and Europe, and ultimately between Russia and NATO. So we're not going to just allow European/NATO troops to be in Western Ukraine and the rest of Ukraine not under the control of Russia. No, we are not going to allow that. And so, but Russia is trying to make some kind of point of agreement. Russia has said, if you want to put UN security forces in Ukraine, or what Russia actually said was, we don't mind if Ukraine be put under the superintendence of the United Nations Security Council, but we're going to make sure that Russian troops are in Ukraine. Because we need to make damn sure that Ukraine is not going to be treaded upon by NATO. You want to have you want Europe to partake in the security of NATO, in the security of Ukraine, fine, but Russian troops have to be in Ukraine. The Americans don't want this. The Ukrainians definitely don't want this. The Germans definitely don't want this. So what's going to happen here? Because the Americans are saying, well, the Europeans can be allowed to participate in Ukraine's security. The Europeans, the Germans, they can be allowed to be in charge of Ukraine's security and basically make Ukraine into a part of Germany's sphere of influence. And the Russians are saying, hell no, we're not going to allow this to happen. Because if you allow Ukraine to be under Germany's watch, well, guess what? It's a World War II situation all over again. Because Russia lost tens of millions of people fighting the Germans in Ukraine to throw the Germans out of Ukraine and out of Eastern Europe and out of Poland. And now you want to allow the German army back into Ukraine so that the Germans can claim Ukraine to be a part of Germany's sphere of influence. No, We're not going to allow that. So it's like it's one of those situations where we're just going to have to guess what's going to happen here. It's a very suspenseful type of situation. What is going to happen here? Perhaps the Americans will say, okay, fine, let's allow a deal. Let's allow Russian troops to be in Ukraine. Let's force the Ukrainians to cede a lot of territory to the Russians. Let's force the Ukrainians to cede Zaporizhia, Donetsk, Luhansk to the Russians. And we can have perhaps a territorial exchange. Maybe the deal will be that the Ukrainians will get Zaporizhia back, and then the Ukrainians will relinquish control of Donetsk and Luhansk to the Russians, and the Russians will get the Donbass. Now, the Russians are already controlling the majority of the Donbass, but what the Russians are saying is, hey, give us the parts of Donbass that are not under our control, and then we have a deal. And don't allow any sort of European troops to be in the parts of Ukraine that we're not controlling. Right now, from what I understand, the Russians are controlling the entirety of Luhansk, and the Russians are controlling the majority of Donetsk. And there is a part of Donetsk that is not under Russian control, but the Russians and the Ukrainians are killing each other over that part of Donetsk. And I believe that part of Donetsk is roughly the size of Delaware. So it's small, but it's not that small. I mean, Delaware is small, but, it's not extremely small. And so the Russians are saying, okay, give us the rest of Donetsk, and we can stop the bloodshed right now. And perhaps the Russians will agree to giving up Zaporizhia, because right now much of Zaporizhia is under the control of the Russians. So who knows what's going to happen? What I do know is that at the end of the day, no matter what happens, even if Trump says, hey, let's make a deal here, let's agree, blah, 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 the Germans are still going to want war with Russia. America can one day say, let's make peace with the Russians, and I hope that does happen, but maybe I'm being a little bit too optimistic. But it's possible that the Americans will agree to a peace deal with the Russians. It's possible. Even if that were to happen, the Germans will not agree, because Germany is very close to Ukraine. And so this situation between Ukraine and Russia is much more serious to the Germans, just given its proximity. And just given the history of Germany trying to control Ukraine. World War I, World War II, the Germans wanted to control Ukraine because of the immense agriculture. And now it's not just the agriculture, it's also about the natural resources. Ukraine is a huge, huge source for all sorts of minerals and natural gas. It's a gold mine, and actually it's a huge gold mine. So the Germans want in on it. The Americans also want in on the minerals. But geopolitically speaking, this means a lot to the Germans, and the Germans are not going to agree to peace. Even if the Germans say they want peace, ultimately they will want war. Just given the history. This is like Turkey versus Armenia. Well, right now, the Turks are saying we want peace with the Armenians. Back in 2020, 2021, 2022, 2023, the Turks were literally backing the ethnic cleansing of the Armenians in Nagorno-Karabakh. So all that talk about peace is bullshit. Same thing goes with the tension between the Russians and the Germans. There's not going to be peace between the Russians and the Germans, just given the history. Just like there's not going to be peace between Serbia and Turkey. Just like there's always going to be tension between Serbia and Albania, or Serbia and Bosnia, Serbia and Croatia. There's going to be tension between these countries, just given the history, just given all of the tension and the antagonism. So the Germans are going to rise. And the Germans are saying, well, we can take part in taking care of Ukraine's security. What that means is we can control Ukraine. We can superintend Ukraine. That is that's a diplomatic way of saying we want to get Ukraine to be under the fold of Germany. And this is something the Russians are not going to accept. So by telling the Russians, hey, the Europeans can be involved, they're giving an offer that the Russians just will not accept. They are giving the Russians an offer they know they will reject. And this is why the Russians are saying, okay, you want to do that? You better allow Russian troops to also be in Ukraine. And that's something that the West doesn't want. So offers are being made, and these are offers that in the long run are not going to lead to a viable and sustainable and a prolonged peace. Ultimately, there's going to be conflict anyway. NATO, the West, is not interested in peace. They're interested in fueling the military-industrial complex, and they are interested in domination. Anyway, you guys just heard some theology. God bless.